here, so you're going to be right in the part of the.
Well, I see, we're zooming too. All right.
I don't know if we're live or if we're just taping, but anyway, thank you everyone for coming. And I know you're here because of the authorities I have to my right. My name is David Shanzer. I'm a professor at the Stanford School of Public Policy. I think and write about things relating to democracy and terrorism, and these are things innately wrapped up into the Middle East and issues relating to Israel. So I'm very happy to be asked to moderate our event this afternoon. The people who you really came to hear need no introduction. Rabbi Greyber from Bethel Synagogue here in Durham, and of course our famous and wonderful Congressman David Price from the 4th District of North Carolina. So this event, we want to thank, of course, the JCC for sponsoring us today. And there were many different entities that were co-sponsoring, supporting, among them J Street, the Judea Reform, Adult Education. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody else, but someone could remind me. We're very grateful for everybody who made this happen this afternoon. The genesis for this idea was that both Congressman Price and Rabbi Greyber have fairly recently, or at least when we were going to do this event in October, they had recently come back from Israel, and we were eager to hear their observations. Now, of course, we've had an election in Israel and an election in the United States, so we have more even to think and talk about. But I'd like to, I think, start by bringing us back to the initial part of why we did this, is that you both recently have been to Israel, and I was wondering if you could each tell us a little bit about your trip, why you went, who you spoke to, and what was your sense of the mood of the country as they were heading into the 4th or 5th election in very recent years. So why don't we start with Congressman Price and then Rabbi Greyber.
All right. You would normally think that simply giving an itinerary would be a very boring way to start, but actually it isn't. I decided as I went through our itinerary and recounted in somewhat systematic fashion the visits that we made, that it's quite significant that there's an issue associated with virtually every one of these people and places. So I will take just a minute to describe the trip that I and my wife led in February. 10 members of Congress and their spouses under the auspices of J Street to Israel and the West Bank over a very intense 6-day period. So let me just tell you what we did in those 6 days, and I will refrain from commentary at this point, but this may serve as something of a guide for the questions we want to raise later. We of course started, as we always do, with Yad Vashem. We also visited the Ben Gurion home in Tel Aviv and had a very enlightening lecture about the founding of Israel. We visited with Foreign Minister Lapid and did not meet with Prime Minister Bennett because he was called away, but we had a good session with Lapid. Met with the Palestinian Prime Minister, Zakaya. Met with the Labour Party chair, Mashele. Met with the member of Knesset and chair of the United Arab List, Mansour Abbas, U.S. Ambassador Tom Knives, and then various gatherings with Israeli and Palestinian leaders. Meeting with Israeli Business Civil Society Group, a meeting with the UNRWA director and several Palestinian leaders from Gaza, a meeting with the Palestinian Civil Society Group, meeting with East Jerusalem Palestinian leaders, meeting with human rights leaders, including turned out Jonathan Katab, who I met with 30 years ago, my first visit to Israel. And then there were site visits. We visited East Jerusalem with the incomparable Danny Seidman, who is the ultimate guide to East Jerusalem. Also, Sheikh Jarrah, the site of the struggle over evictions and other sites in East Jerusalem. We visited a settlement and spoke with settler leaders in the Benjamin Regional Council. We visited Kfar Aza on the Gaza border and saw firsthand some of the effects of living under the threat of rocket fire from Gaza daily. We were to visit Hope Flowers School, a school in Bethlehem that I've had to come to the rescue several times, as the separation fence comes very near to their border. There was a shooting of a police shooting of a young Palestinian teenager that morning. So we couldn't go to the school, but the leaders of the school met us. We were debriefed on their situation. We visited Hebron, also a memorable point to visit. The situation there where as you well know, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and a few hundred settlers, and as many IDF soldiers to guard those settlers. The village next door was also a sobering visit. Visited the Meyer Kahane Memorial Park and the shrine to Baruch Goldstein that was set up in that park, who murdered the 29 Muslim worshippers. We visited in the Hebron Hills. We visited the village of Al Tawani, a village that has existed for who knows how long, but is now being encroached upon by nearby settlements and has been subjected to a good deal of settler violence. So, pretty well covered the landscape in Israel at the West Bank. As I say, there's an issue or a question associated with all of these people and all of these visits. Maybe I'll leave it at that. I am happy to elaborate on any of this, but also to let me mention one thing. When we got back, when we returned, we decided that we would organize a letter, what we called our flashpoints letter, which would highlight basically the theme that if you don't find the Middle East will find you. Apropos of any idea that we might de-emphasize the Middle East in U.S. diplomacy. So we reflected on our visit with our ambassador and on the conclusions we had drawn. And four of us who had been on the trip, namely Jennifer Wexton of Virginia, Joaquin Castro of Texas, Barbara Lee of California, and myself, we circulated the letter. And in very short order, about 80 signatures from Democratic members, and we went ahead and sent it because we thought it was important to that. But we called it our flashpoints letter. And the idea was to call attention to flashpoints, to if I can find my notes here, call attention to flashpoints to areas that we felt needed attention and that were worthy of America's diplomatic effort. We did make note of some efforts that have taken place already. There's a great sensitivity at that point with the Minute Stampede government, and the sense that things were very, very fragile, and that bold moves weren't going to be forthcoming, and that the U.S. should not insist on bold moves simply because the government was very fragile. Of course, that could easily become a kind of all-purpose excuse to do nothing. And that's the danger. I think that was the danger in that governmental situation, where it could face a very different situation here going forward.
Why don't we have Rabbi Greyber
go ahead.
explain his trip, and
go ahead.
I'll
return to that. I do want to say something about it. Thank you.
All right, and I'll borrow that microphone if you don't mind. Okay. Good afternoon. I just want to say a couple of things before talking about my trip. I expressed this personally to Congressman Price, that my condolences on the death of his wife, Lisa, in June. She was a dear member of this community, and it is just a terrible loss. And I also want to say just a tremendous thank you for many, many years of service that you've given to in representing our state, and doing so with a sense of thoughtfulness and dedication. That all we can say is we pray that there will be more people who discharge their duties in the way that you have. So I'm very, very grateful to you. I had the pleasure, so I guess I had a twofold trip. This was an interfaith trip that had been years in the making, several times postponed, but ended up finally happening. And we brought together members of Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church, who Bethel, we roomed with them, so to speak, for a year while our building was under renovation, and Congressman Price came and spoke when we went back into our building, but we formed some wonderful relationships with them. And we ended up having the pastor of the Church of Reconciliation in Chapel Hill, Alan Greyber, came on the trip, as well as a local Mormon leader who actually writes in the and speaks in the Mormon Church about Jewish Mormon relations. So in addition to members of both communities, we also had some wonderful leadership. And our trip, was, I think, less, with some sightseeing. Some, we headed north, but for somebody who's been to Israel so many times, it was really wonderful for me to have the opportunity to go there and visit Christian holy sites, and to see the land of Israel and the state of Israel through the eyes of Christians, and had some wonderful moments of sharing at the Sea of Galilee, which is a nice place for Jews and has some obviously important history in terms of the rabbinic period, but obviously many holy sites there. We also, so we visited archaeological sites, things up north, and spent most of our time in Jerusalem. I will say that half of my trip, unfortunately, was cut short because I had a case of COVID. But Reverend Katie Crow went along, and we had a tour guide. And I actually stayed after my trip and continued my studies at Harpin Institute, which were very fruitful, and then ended up doing a trip to Hebron, which the group on the trip did, and then I went and did that with the Harpin Institute. I think the things which I want to emphasize from our trip were, number one, Congressman Price, you mentioned going to Yad Vashem, and Israel exists not only as a refuge. It exists as a place for the Jewish people, that is a historical home and a spiritual home for Jews around the world. But going to Yad Vashem and experiencing that with fellow Christians in our community was, as it always is, but it's deeply meaningful, because I think what I would emphasize is that it really helps the Jewish community to feel seen and known and understood for the vulnerabilities that we feel, and that honestly we've only continued to feel more intensely as anti-Semitism has spiked in the United States, and just knowing that even since then there was the PBS special about the very little that the United States did during the Holocaust in order to provide a refuge for Jews. I think that sharing that experience was very, very significant. And the other piece I would emphasize is that we did go to Hebron. We had a chance to visit with Alon Tal, who's a native of North Carolina, and was in the Knesset in this past government. He welcomed our group, which was a wonderful opportunity. And when our group did go to, there was a trip to Bethlehem that the Christians did as pilgrimage, and the Jews enjoyed it, and then went to Hebron. I wasn't on that particular day at Hebron, but I will share my own trip there began. It was a very well planned trip because we began with an archaeological tour. There's actually extraordinary archaeology that exists in Hebron, really seeing 3, 4, 5,000 years of biblical history. And then seeing some of the things that Congressman Price referenced, which is that the people who are in Hebron are extremists, and it's a place of extraordinary tension. We met with members of Breaking the Silence, or Israeli soldiers who speak about the things that they did or were part of their service. And so you really feel this the conflict between a sense of shame of some of the things that are happening there, and also a deep sense of the Jewish connection to the place. I can say more. There's been a lot that's happened.
Well, I need you
since
to
then.
reflect, if you could, get to Congressman Price's flash. But Rabbi, you've traveled, as you said, to Israel many times. What did you sense of the mood of the country here, midway through 2022, and in comparison to maybe other times you visited?
So I think we all see Israel through our own eyes. I and the people who I got a chance to learn with and hang out with, I think, and this is related to the politics, which it never takes you long to get into. At that point, felt a real sense of optimism that Israel's last government was an extraordinary coalition of diverse voices, people very much on the right, together with the first time that Arabs have been part of the governing coalition, and a sense of let's work together, let's put the national interests at heart, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, I felt a great sense of optimism. I think one of the things that I see from the election is that there were things that I wasn't seeing. Israel was there were terrible riots between Jews and Arabs that afflicted the country. This is before the government took power. It was the summer of 2020. It was summer of 2020, and those riots really left a scar among many Israelis who were not part of this governing coalition, but who had a very deep sense of distrust. And I think that's part of what fed into the election results. But Israel is a place of contradictions. Great hope. I think at that time, a feeling that Israel's government was something that America could learn from, that a lot of countries in the world could learn from, by people of different perspectives being able to govern together. I want to say one of the things I appreciate, I think Congressman Price and I have met a number of times. We disagree on some aspects of Israeli policy, but have always been good. I have felt a real sense of being good partners in conversation. And one of the things that I want to model for this is just the ability to do that sort of thing, which is becoming a rare commodity.
Congressman, I know you wanted to talk about your letter, but also your sense of the mood of the country when you were visiting.
I think reflect on that too. I would agree. Of course, I always am reluctant to come home, even after a very intense visit in a place, and say that I know something about the mood of the country. That's often a question, and I think it's presumptuous to think that we have a kind of unique insight by virtue of a few days on the ground. But having said that, you do get a sense of what people are thinking and saying, and I would agree this was a rather hopeful time. There had been some conciliatory gestures in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Kind of went under the heading, I guess, of shrinking the conflict. There had been some accommodation in terms of work permits and family reunification, and the Israeli government had demurred on the question of building an E1 territory. All of that was considered a positive sign and considered something that the US government had a hand in. But there was also this great sense that the government coalition was fragile, as indeed it of course turned out to be. And that there was a kind of interesting complacency, not exactly complacency, but maybe inaction that can come from a sense of fragility. You just refrain from any bold moves at all. If you don't watch it, you know, there's that danger. It can become an all-purpose reason for just maintaining the status quo, and there was some of that too. We did meet with a range of leaders in civil society and business in government and these and I think the sense that the left in Israeli politics has been marginalized, that the country is going to be electing probably conservative governments for a long time, or at least governments with a substantial conservative component, and that the Israeli-Palestinian question simply wasn't front of mind in Israel. And so that too, I think, is what you pick up very, very quickly in discussions about Israeli politics. We of course talked to a lot of critics of the Israeli government as well, both on the Palestinian side and among the Israelis. And I think the point of view that we reflected in this Flashpoints letter, that there are festering issues that, if left unaddressed, are going to be in big trouble. First of all, I think that has been borne out in the ensuing months. And secondly, that's not just something we think, that's something a lot of Israelis and Palestinians think. And there is a place, I think, for a constructive American role here. I don't think there'll ever be movement toward any kind of negotiated settlement without an American role. But even in these lesser matters, even the American government, Tom Friedman always says that one role of the American government is to be a reality check on all sides. And when the Trump administration became a total advocate for the Netanyahu government and then some, that reality check went away. And we began to deal with questions like annexation and other more extreme policies. So I think sober, fair-minded people on both sides do welcome a constructive American role, and in fact think that both sides need it.
Okay, well, you've come back and we've had an election in Israel. So obviously all of us are aware of the results, and now the coalition building process is happening. What are your impressions of what has occurred and what we need to be watching for in the weeks and of course months ahead as the government ultimately is seated? And of course, we don't know what the outcome of the negotiations will be, but we can anticipate possibly.
So, this is not my field of expertise. I'm a rabbi and not a commentator. I do keep up with things. For people who are unaware, the results of the election, the Netanyahu bloc, we'll use that term just for purposes, control 64 out of 120, which in Israeli dom, that's a pretty good,
Not quite a landslide, but a victory.
It's not quite a landslide. I think I'm going to try and be a little bit hopeful, which is that this is sort of a version of America's electoral college. Okay, in other words, the actual vote was a very slim margin in terms of the plurality. I think there was something like 1,200 or 1,400 votes that separated what I would call a pro-Netanyahu bloc versus an anti-Netanyahu bloc. It ended up being 64 to 56 because David Horowitz, who's the editor-in-chief of Times for Israel, commented about how Netanyahu was much more effective in his management of the campaign, and essentially made sure that there were no wasted votes as part of his coalition. There were 4 to 6 parties, depending on how you put it together: the Likud, Shas, United Torah Judaism, and what a party called Religious Zionism, which is actually a combination of an alliance of 3 parties. So that made sure that there were no wasted votes. Some estimates say that there were up to 300,000 votes that were wasted on the anti-Netanyahu side by splitting of the Arab vote and Meretz not making the minimum threshold. So I think I say all that to say Israel, this will be or has the potential to be a very stable governing coalition, but the divide, I think, is still very real. It's most likely that it will be a hard right coalition. There is a possibility that Netanyahu will struggle to essentially put together a coalition with some people who the people who are part of specifically Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. These are not the history here is that they don't compromise. They do not compromise. They are ideologues for a variety of reasons, and getting them to compromise to essentially make a coalition may be difficult. And a dream scenario might be that that you have Gantz and Likud forming a center coalition, but I think it's very unlikely.
Yeah, it looks like we're going to try the other way first, right?
Yeah.
I think the immediate effort is going to be put together that right-wing government. Smotrich is insisting on the defense industry, and the defense industry, of course, has a major and a minor portfolio. He's interested in the minor portfolio. Unlike other defense ministers, he's interested in the settlements and in the role that the defense minister has in overseeing the settlements. I don't think that bodes well, but that tells you where he's coming from. It's hard to imagine that Netanyahu would award him the defense ministry, but that is a pretty hard bargain going on right now.
And one thing which I want to just point out. Many people in the defense establishment in Israel have deep concerns about either Smotrich or Ben-Gvir having these posts. Ben-Gvir is did not do IDF service because the IDF thought him too much of an extremist, and Smotrich has little to no experience in terms of defense whatsoever. I want to say that both of these characters and the parties that they represent are extremely hostile to gays. There was already a call to cancel the gay pride parade in Jerusalem. They are hostile to non-Orthodox Jews. There's been a call already to change Israel's policy of immigration and in terms of anybody with a Jewish grandparent. There's been calls by some of the advisors to say that we should have essentially a Jewish theocracy. Smotrich has recently moderated himself by saying that he would only advocate for the expulsion of Arabs who are disloyal. But he has called before for the expulsion of all Arabs. These are extremely toxic forces. There are concerns about overturning something in the Supreme Court, which essentially allows the Supreme Court to override legislation. There are deep concerns about the future of Israel's democracy from these forces. And so controlling the damage, from my perspective, that they can do within the governing coalition is something that I think Netanyahu will attempt to do in these negotiations, but it will be a hard bargain. The other thing which I just want to ask you about, Congressman Price, I read a piece just recently that Shin Bet Chief Ronen Bar expressed concerns that the Palestinian Authority could collapse because and that's that there is a tremendous amount of corruption, that they've lost control of some cities, and the collapse of the Palestinian Authority would be an absolute disaster, and in some ways would play into this extremist government. I'm curious to hear your reflections.
Philip, sure, I have some thoughts on that, and they're not very optimistic, I'm afraid. But let me say on the formation of this government, this Ben-Gvir is he does have quite a history. What we saw on display there outside of Hebron with the Kahan Park and the Goldstein Shrine, that's his faction. Those are his that is his segment of Israeli politics that he represents, and he of course is making a very hard bid for the security, public security ministry. The other one we need to be aware of before we turn to other things is the former ambassador Ron Dermer. There are indications that Ron Dermer may be foreign minister. I don't know if that's these are just news reports, but I think they're pretty credible, and I think that would be a huge mistake. If you're talking about a bipartisan American support for Israel and dealing with diplomatic relations in a way that transcends party lines, Ron Dermer is absolutely the worst choice that Netanyahu could make. He's as ambassador, he should have been a reality check on his prime minister, right? I mean, the notion that Netanyahu would come here in the middle of this intense debate over the Iran agreement and would go behind Obama's back, accept a Republican invitation to address the Congress, and that his ambassador would not say, "Wait a minute, Mr. Prime Minister, that is not what you should do in terms of bipartisan support for this relationship." On the contrary, Ron Dermer engineered that. I saw I had not heard this story before, but in Haaretz, I just was looking this week, there was a columnist. Here's a Nancy Pelosi quote. She said she pointed to her door with a group of visitors. And here's what she said: "Do you know what's special about that door? Ron Dermer will never walk through it." I cannot exaggerate how divisive that would be as a foreign minister appointment to give Ron Dermer that post. At a minimum, there'd be just extraordinary fence spending to do. So this cabinet formation is very important. There's some other commentary to the effect that, and I hope you're right about Netanyahu in the end having to pull back on some of this, but he probably should have pulled back initially. Probably is giving, or is given the impression he's going to have to give more than he really has to. I mean, look, I've got a very good vote here. Easily the dominant group in the Knesset. Why he is, bargaining so publicly for these kind of positions with these extreme elements is not entirely clear. And of course, it's not entirely clear that's the way it will go in the end. The Palestinian Authority, very, very dysfunctional situation on the Palestinian side. It has been for years with, of course, Hamas in charge of Gaza and the Palestinian Authority more or less in charge of the West Bank. A very important security arrangement. No question that the security relationship is absolutely critical to Israel and to the peace and security and any prospect that we have for better relations. But the Palestinian Authority is weak and divided and corrupt, and there are well-known problems which have been endemic, really, but have gotten worse. And there's of course a leadership crisis possibly coming with as Abu Mazen leaves the scene inevitably in the next few years. In the longer view, I think history will record a great failure of Israeli governments, especially Netanyahu governments, and our government. Great failure over the years to strengthen and empower moderate forces on the Palestinian side. And that would mean some support for the Palestinian Authority as a viable governing entity. I remember thinking this 15 years ago. Netanyahu never, ever that I can remember, did anything other than paint all Palestinian leadership with the same broad brush, and that most certainly included the Palestinian Authority. You know, there needed to be an agreed upon diplomatic government, and Bennett and Lapid articulated this quite clearly. But they said quite clearly going in, we need a partner. We need to figure out ways to empower the Palestinian Authority. And they did some things that I think moved in that direction, but to no avail, as it turned out, probably not in the long run. But I certainly think that is a failure of our country and Israel. Never to figure out how to, I mean, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy for Netanyahu. He always said he never had a partner for peace, and the way he dealt with the Palestinian Authority, he made sure he didn't have a partner for peace. And, you know, he has told his associates in this country for a long time what he intended, and I think so Palestinians have plenty of blame to shoulder on their own for their failures and their corruption and their dysfunction. I'm not saying that Israel created this problem, but I don't think we or Israel did anything to help solve it either.
That's a good question. So I'm curious about the following thing. As a rabbi, you know, one of my teachers, Daniel Hardman, puts it this way. He said, "I'm not going to let the Jewish people walk away from each other on my watch." Okay, and that job just got much more difficult because there's a lot going on in Israel that many American Jews, myself included, are extremely concerned about. And when many Jews express concern about those things, progressive Jews, but you know, in general, we have the following experience. We express those concerns, and then standing next to us is somebody who says, "I agree completely. You know, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free." And we turn to the right and go, "No. That's not what I'm talking about." Right? In other words, the experience is that when we express concerns about Israel's direction, that gets hijacked and co-opted into demonization of Israel. And I gave a high holiday sermon in which I talked about the way in which anti-Zionism can be, it's not always, but can become anti-Semitic. And one of the ways that is demonization. It means this is 100% Israel's fault, and there's no responsibility to the Palestinians whatsoever, and therefore Israel needs to cease to exist. Sometimes the second part doesn't get said, but it's implied, and the Palestinians, you know, and just an ignoring of any Palestinian responsibility. So I really I'm curious to hear from you. What do you think are the most effective ways that the American Jewish community, you know, I don't want us to walk away, and I'm not walking away. We are, you know, this is hard. Israel, you know, went through the democracy, the elections were fair. Do I wish they were different? I do. Am I concerned about the relationship? I am. But I also don't want that language to be co-opted into either anti-Semitism itself, and I'll even push further, people who say we need to cut, funding for defensive systems. Because that's the only language that Israel understands, which for me, that's a red line, that's a danger zone, right? Israel faces, and one of the things I think I've appreciated so much about our relationship as we've talked about various things, is an understanding that Israel faces extraordinary military vulnerabilities from Hamas, from Hezbollah, in the Middle East, and that the trying to move Israel can never cross those red lines of ignoring Israel's vulnerabilities.
Right. By the way, I left off one point in our trip. We visited an Arab site. It's just remarkable. The amazing system. And we, same time we were down on the Gaza border visiting the village that had been subjected to rocket fire, we also visited an Arab site. There's quite a remarkable system. And by the way, one of the best commentaries I've seen on the Israeli elections, which what triggered the thought, was what you said about the reaction of the American Jewish community, was a former rabbi here, Barry Goblin in Arrest, had a very, very insightful piece on that, I think, just about happened with the election. How do you express your love of your country? Whether it's a kind of how do we express American patriotism? How do we express a love and a respect and a support for Israel or for any other country? I get the problem. I understand the problem that you're talking about how criticism gets blown up and misinterpreted. But we really have to insist that that a loving kind of criticism is not only legitimate, but really is necessary. Let me just talk about American patriotism for a second. I don't know whether this is admirable. I suspect it is. I suspect it's the way we express a love of any organization of which we're a part. Remember maybe you don't, but anyway, I was once impressed by a formulation that I heard from a friend. That there are three kinds of patriotism: two bad and one good. The two bad kinds are loveless critics and uncritical lovers. The good kind of patriotism is a kind of loving criticism. And that's the kind of patriot I try to be, and I think it's the kind of patriot we all try to be. And for someone who, this kind of stuff that's going on now about teaching only heroic versions of American history. That's actually been written into school policy in Johnston County, North Carolina. That you teach about American history only in heroic terms. I mean, that goes against our faith traditions in the worst sort of way. I wrote a column on this and read a column that I think a Presbyterian minister said, the Hebrew prophets didn't write to make us proud. The Hebrew prophets wrote to make us faithful. And so whatever lesson we draw from that, I think there's plenty of lessons to draw from it. I think the debate over Israeli politics and policy, not just among American Jews, but among concerned people of all sorts. There are lines not to be crossed, but I think you maintain that tension somehow, and you respect that. You respect that. You respect that there are going to be differences about politics and policy, and we of course have to always affirm our respect, our affection, our friendship with the state of Israel and the kind of unbreakable tie that exists between this country and Israel since its founding. But I do think that the kind of critical stance that we assume is an act of expressing that concern and that loyalty, not a violation of it. If it's properly done, and we just have to judge what we're dealing with when we get into these debates.
I have one more topic I'd like to put on the table, and I want to get the audience involved. I think one of the things that, at least from my mind, that observing that is new. I mean, the Palestinian conflict has been stalemated and deteriorating and moves in different directions for, literally since Oslo began to deteriorate. But what concerns me the most, I think, is what's happening between Jews and Arab Israelis in Israel, and the tension that's arisen there, and what that means for the state. So, could either of you share some of your observations about what this election, what this potential new government means, and I guess how we as American Jews and friends and lovers of Israel should try to weigh in on those issues. I mean, the Arab population, as I understand, is 20% of the Israeli citizenry. We're not talking about the issue of people who live in the territories, but who are citizens of the state. So how should we be thinking, and what should we be concerned about on that particular issue going forward?
I want to just clarify a couple of things. Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis, as they are increasingly referring to themselves, refer to Arabs who have citizenship in the state of Israel, and they're 20% of Israel's population. Not referring to Palestinians in the West Bank who are under the Palestinian Authority or Gaza. And, the greater minds than mine can explain, what happened in the election. But from here, the sense is that the Arab bloc was divided. And as much as Mansour Abbas gave a lot of hope to people, he's the leader of the Ram party, and the Ram party was the first Arab party that was part of the governing coalition. He was also deeply assailed within the Arab Israeli community by people who do not believe, who are violently against Israeli democracy, who are violently against the Israeli government. And he paid a price and was not able to sort of hold that together in getting people to participate in elections in an effective way. And I think, I have great pride in many things. Many people, are ignorant of the fact that Israel has an Arab on the Supreme Court, that an Arab Israeli has been the head of one of Israel's universities, that there's a tremendous upward mobility in Arab Israeli society, and that dwarfs anything you see in the rest of the Middle East and the rest of the Arab world. That there's a lot of things, and the participation in the democracy itself is tremendous. So there's a lot to be proud of, and there's a lot of anger there because for the past 2 months, there's been a quiet intifada, quiet, not bombings, but stabbings. Day after day after day, there have been stabbings and attacks, and there's been a lawlessness in Arab cities where the Israeli police, where Arabs are turning to the Israeli police and saying, we need you to come in and police our neighborhoods. By the way, because we don't feel safe, right? And the rule of law is not established in our neighborhoods. And Israel owes a governmental and democratic responsibility to those neighborhoods. And yet, there are also forces within Israeli society. This coalition I don't think it's going beyond the pale to say that there's racism. There is an extreme it's extremely problematic in its view towards Arabs. The hope, Yossi Klein Halevi, I'll just read you a piece of something that he wrote a couple of days ago. He said, I didn't, I didn't copy the hopeful part of it. All I copied was the last. But basically what he said at the end of his column is, I'm not going to give up on fighting for the vision of Israel that I believe in. And I'm trying to support, the conservative and reform movements. I'm trying to support Seeds for Peace. I'm trying to support organizations that are on the ground and doing real work towards coexistence, towards peaceful coexistence. But the question of how it is that you influence Palestinian society in terms of corruption, and how it is that you affect Arab Israeli society is a very dangerous and I'm not, I have real concerns.
Just quickly, and I realize this comment is naive in the sense that it's not really grounded in the present reality on either side, but in a well-functioning, inclusive democracy, these Arab citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel ought to be full participants and ought to be fully represented in their government. That would mean that Israeli parties and politicians do not exclude these citizens and their parties from a government. Do not make a campaign issue of not including them at any cost. And it would mean on the Palestinian side that they somehow stop boycotting and stop these conflictful tactics among themselves and become effective democratic participants. Right? Isn't that what would be productive in the end? That's what you would think an inclusive democracy would require. But right now, the behavior on both sides doesn't really lend itself to that. I think the inclusion of the Arab list, Knesset member, Sir Abbas, he was a pretty interesting fellow. We had a good visit with him, and very pragmatic politician. Unfortunately, his views did not prevail on among enough Arab citizens to create a really effective bloc, and of course this new Israeli government wanted no part of the Arab parties. So, but I think goes without saying there's a lot of barriers to be overcome on both sides before you would have fully participating Arab citizens and that contribute to the formation of the Israeli government.
If I can, I want to just add a couple of quick things. I think that I will read you the Yossi Klein Halevi piece. What he said is that as he went into the voting booth, he said, I felt the suspicion as soon as I entered. Neighbors eyed each other warily. So who are you voting for? Are you with the camp that seeks to empty Israel of its Jewish identity, or with the camp that seeks to empty Israel of its democratic identity?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's a part of the election that I think, again, you asked me about my itinerary. I don't know that I was paying enough attention. There was a whole protest vote for someone named Shaked. I think she got 60,000 votes, which really can move the meter in some of these things. And they voted for her because there wasn't, and Daniel Gordis has spoken about this, there wasn't a compelling, there's a concern about, does the left and center left understand that part of the purpose of the state of Israel is not merely to be a United States in the Middle East that has McDonald's, etc., but that it's here in order to be a Jewish state and a democratic state, but a Jewish state, right? And so
this idea that Israel is facing a dilemma, and what was so unique about Mansour Abbas, was his willingness to say to Israeli Jews, I recognize that this is a Jewish state. I recognize that there's something special about having a place of your own, and I don't think that that's illegitimate, and I want to participate in it, and I want to be part of it, right? But that message, ultimately, got through to some parts of the electorate, but it did not resonate with a whole section of the Israeli electorate.
And you're saying the anti-Netanyahu bloc just seemed too secular for too many.
That's
Jews.
right. That's right. The argument would be that it's not only security concerns, but are you articulating a way in which not just that Israel is a liberal democracy, but that Jewish values can be part of the state and part of the discourse, but not a theocracy. And then because this shouldn't be a newsflash, a lot of people in Israel care about Judaism, okay, and they don't want just an American, a Paris in the Middle East, right? They want the Israel's democracy to be a liberal democracy. They don't want a theocracy, but they're not looking to create a state where Hanukkah is not celebrated in the public space, and where you can't feel Shabbat as any different, right, than other days. And they want a vision of how does that work, right?
All right, I will be happy to share my microphone with anyone who'd like to ask a question. I know, where's my friend Dick Collin, or Carlos Sim? Okay, why don't we go, you start, and then,
Hi, thank you very much. Congressman Hyatt, when we spoke about this, as I mentioned it, the Ratcliffe House 32 years ago. And at that time, I asked you about the understanding of members of Congress of the different political forces in Israel at the time, concerned about traditional right-wing anti-Semitism, and whether or not there were enough people in Congress who understood that Israel was a democracy, that there are two sides. Now it looks in Congress that there are a large number of people who are Israel right or wrong, who we call people in love but not critical, not only largely the Republican Party, some Jews, but also there's a squad that one can view as being critical, non-loving. And I'm wondering about how you perceive the size of the group in the middle, critical lovers.
Well, I really appreciate that question, because it's gives me a chance to counter what I think is a pretty widespread misrepresentation of where the Democratic Party is these days, and what that division looks like. And I this isn't a book pitch, but I'll just say I brought out a 4th edition of my book in the middle of 2020, and I added an extensive foreign policy section about the Middle East and my own efforts over the years to engage. First with Danny Abraham's Center for Middle East Peace, a lot of efforts to promote the peace process in the 90s. And then through more recent administrations, promoting the Iran nuclear agreement, promoting two-state diplomacy, attempting to move our caucus in the direction of supportive of Israel, but in the sense of a kind of balanced approach to the issues of the day, and attempting to move toward a negotiated two-state solution, which I still believe, although the prospects are pretty grim right now on both sides. I understand that very well, but in the end of the day, I don't understand how there's any solution to some kind of negotiated settlement that gives both peoples a homeland, a place they can call their own and can govern democratically. The flashpoints letter, you can already infer what was in it, but that was an interesting kind of test. We got instantly Democratic members ready to sign off. No Republicans. And AIPAC opposed the letter for I can tell you what they said, didn't dispute a thing that we said. It's just that shouldn't be doing this. It's a fragile time. We were talking about things like evictions and demolitions and on the Palestinian side, inside and these prisoner family payments. Talking about things that had the potential to fester and to become a real threat to the stability and peace of the region and certainly to any prospect of a two-state settlement. So I don't like for it to be so. I'd like for there to be more of a coming together on these things. But I do think, and I think that's the sentiment of most Democrats right now. Not a kind of right or wrong attitude, but a sense that we need to engage and of course fully express our support for the minimal support anywhere in the Democratic Party, say for the BDS movement. Or for cutting off aid. No, the idea is that there should be a base of support, a basic support, but then along with that then should come the ability to work with our friend and ally to engage in on all sorts of issues. So the Democratic caucus has moved in that respect, and I do write about that, about the but that's not about the squad. I told Ben Samuels, the Haaretz editor, wrote a piece, did an exit interview on my leaving the Congress, and we were reflecting on these things. And I said, the point is that there are a few members out there who are very extreme in their views, or for that matter, a few Israel right or wrong members. The vast majority of the Democratic caucus, I think, is of a more balanced view, and I think there's been movement in that direction over the time that I've been in the Congress.
Let me ask both of you for an assessment of the incoming government, particularly Mr. Netanyahu. My subject matter is really the cooperation between Israel and the United States in the interests of both security. There's a long history of security cooperation, sharing of intelligence, of restraint on both sides, and the importance for both countries' security, not just in the Middle East, but in general, issues of terrorism and others. Do you think that Mr. Netanyahu recognizes that the appointment of Mr. Smotrich threatens the cooperation between the United States security apparatus and the Israeli security apparatus, and that it could be harm to the detriment of both? Could he be appointed?
You're much more qualified to answer this. I can only say one thing I would point out is that Netanyahu, I mean, first of all, he does have experience. He has more than anybody else. So he's aware of those issues. And the other thing is, from a security perspective, what a lot of people say about him is that he has a big bark, but he's actually quite reserved in terms of when he goes in and does things like that. I hope that the answer to your question is yes.
I do too, and I think they're going to soon have a sense of that. I just think Netanyahu is a complicated individual. His motivations at this juncture are quite complicated. It has to do, I think, with his own legal jeopardy, and his desire to hold on to power at all costs, as well as whatever he may know about the the interests of his country and what that requires. Netanyahu is capable of, Dick, you know more about this than either of us probably, but I just would observe that Netanyahu is capable of reckless behavior when it seems to serve his political interests, and I hope this isn't. I hope at this juncture the national interest prevails.
You think that the American government has expressed its views on the subject of this appointment to them, to Mr. Netanyahu?
That's an important question. I think the answer is yes. There have been some hints publicly that the word has been passed about Ben Gvir as well, and that Knives, the deconstructing of some of his comments was to that effect. There's a group of us in the House who have contemplated what we should do. There will be some. I mean, this is really if these people get these appointments, there's really going to be an issue with the U.S. and other Western countries about, honestly, do we deal with them? I mean, there are instances where we don't do that, and when there are very problematic members with blood on their hands, in cabinets around the world, that's an extreme situation, but it's not out of the question here, and some of us have been debating whether we should raise that possibility in some kind of effort, and I think we're going to wait and see what Netanyahu does.
One thing which, just to put a little bit of context about this, not necessarily related to Netanyahu in particular, but I do hope that people see that, Israel, what can I say, is, and this is not to justify it, but it's to say Israel is no different and is being affected by something that is actually happening all around the world. In the United States, you had a tremendous number of Republicans who ran for Congress as election deniers, which undermines the democracy, the democratic processes of this country. You have France that has now elected a hard right, and Italy and Sweden. These are democracies, but the rise of anti-democratic and fascist forces is something that's taken place. Some people attribute that to social media and the polarizing of discourse. And I think that it will be, the truth is that I think during the Trump administration, there was some cases where Israel was concerned about sharing certain intelligence, with our country. And so these are all, it's an unfortunate piece that I think that governments are gonna have to navigate. When you want to make sure that the people who you're working with are responsible actors. I also think that there is a whole piece to this which is again not about Israel and the Palestinians. It's about bigger things happening in the Arab world. Where Iran Iran is trying to assert its hegemony, and America, Israel is trying to figure out, how do we form alliances that will keep us safe, and this also has to do with Russia and Ukraine and influence. It's a very, very complicated piece. I'll just say that taking the group from the Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church, I called Reverend Pearl before our session today, and I just said, I'd love to have you whisper in my ear, what's one thing that you took away from it? And, she, what she really appreciated about the trip was that going gave her a much deeper sense of the complexity. And what I want to fight against, and maybe it's two sides of the coin, is that there are people who say any sort of criticism against Israel is illegitimate and anti-Semitic and it's terrible, and that's not okay. And there are people who say that that Israel is an apartheid state, that this is that this is all Israel's fault, and that that there are no legitimate, and that also is not okay. This is, we need, there's a lot going on here, and we need more words, not fewer.
We have time for one more
Actually,
question.
Can I just say,
Yeah, sure.
either David or Dick, I'd be quite interested in your view on this. On what kind of signals our country should be sending, and then what our country's posture should be. Should these problematic people be in positions of great authority?
He's got the microphone.
Well, I would say, that the American government is in a sensitive position because it cannot, or should not, at least threaten Mr. Netanyahu with anything that we would regret later on if he acts contrary to what we think is best for both of our countries. On the other hand, I think they should just express a worry and wait to see what the situation is. If, as you say, Mr. Smotrich is more interested in the minor aspects of the Ministry of Defense rather than the major overarching issues of the Defense Ministry, there may be a way for the United States to meter out its cooperation and its relationship with the Israeli defense establishment, and then with the other gentleman on the public security aspects of it. So the wait and see is probably a Lincoln-esque way to deal with difficult problems.
I suspect a much stronger message is being sent internally, don't you?
Yeah.
I think so, and that matter portfolio is that's the way it's described, but that is settlement policy, and that is also a matter of legitimate U.S. concern.
And especially if, U.S. security aid is being used in an oppressive way in the territories, that of course can have a lot of direct blowback, to the United States. So I don't think just because it's a secondary portfolio, it necessarily means there aren't U.S. interests at stake. It's a little harder to get involved in telling Israel who its domestic security person should be. But out of defense, I don't think the U.S. government should or would be hesitating to make its views known.
But the U.S. government doesn't want to surrender its credibility on the subject of restraining Israel in its activities towards Iran. That's a critical aspect, I think, of the security.
Say that sentence again.
Iran.
But say the sentence again. The U.S. government does not want
to act in such a way as to lessen its influence on Israel's behavior when it comes to restraining Israel's actions towards Iran.
Right. Okay, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I also promised one person in the back to ask a question. So we could have a quick question and hopefully a brief response from our panelists, and then we can all continue talking among each other.
I was very grateful. Thanks so much for the service of the meetings. Really appreciate it. I hear everything. I'm interested in your view of the American Jewish communities shaping American policy for Israel and Israeli policy itself. Is it your opinion that lobbying organizations like AIPAC or JQ really do have significant power of shaping American policy toward Israel, and certainly even secondary Israeli policy, which is governed by geopolitical, strategic, financial interess, and largely driven by, in the United States, by the President and Defense Department, State Departments. I just wonder, you're even a compliment to many how powerful do you think these other organizations really are in shaping policy for Israel?
Loaded question. I'll give you as objective an answer as I can without any editorializing. I think those organizations, J Street and APAC, and to a lesser extent, groups like the Peace Now organization, the Israel Policy Forum, which dates from the Rabbi days. These groups are well staffed, well funded, and often very articulate in their views, and often at odds, as you know, and the main players in the electoral arena are APAC and JSU. APAC in its day was a extremely important galvanizer of American support for Israel. I say in its day because a lot of the founders, people like Don Dine and Ken Wallach and many others have since left the organization and have become critics. But it was important in its day. Sarah Herman, a dear friend of Lisa's family and of mine, was one of the founders who then later went in another direction. So it really did galvanize that support, and was an important organization. It did, I think, it was it always professed to be supportive of whatever government was in charge in Israel. But as you know, there's been a perception, I think, largely accurate, that it was tended to favor the more conservative governments, the right-wing governments. And one of the things I wrote about in my own experience is how I was asked, to sign on to things as a new candidate for Congress in the 80s, which of course were later matters of negotiation, but I was so glad never to support negotiating with the PLO, for example, things like that. So there was a kind of what emerged as a kind of hard line that was unchallenged, and it wasn't that people so much agreed with that as they just did not want to create political problems for themselves. And so often these fire-breathing resolutions would go through and hardly have a Senate word, and that's what began to change. That's what began to change in the 1990s and early 2000s. When J Street came along, which was 2007, it did make a huge difference, but not in the sense that it changed people's minds. I don't think that happened much. I think what it did was, Bridgetti, the grassroots organization, which had a good presence here in the Triangle, was the predecessor. And I think what J Street did was legitimate a more balanced point of view, and gave political cover, if you want to put it that way, to people who had been uncomfortable. I remember I said in my book so many times I was faced with a APAC-inspired resolution back in those years, and I remember saying, geez, I'll vote for this and have to explain myself, or I'll vote against it and have to explain myself. That's not exactly where I want to be. There's great, as James Madison discovered in the Constitutional Convention, there is great power in doing the first draft. There's great power in doing the first draft of something. And I began to figure that out. And some of my compatriots said, so we began drawing our own resolutions up. We did a series of things in support of diplomacy in the Iran situation. And we got a lot of Republicans to go along with those things. We said it our way. And we, of course, supporting two-state diplomacy all along the way, and so forth. So basically, I think did legitimate, gave some political cover to people who wanted to take a different approach, and so that's where we are now. you know, there were a number of candidates that both organizations endorsed in this last election, but there were some clear differences and divisions. But to answer your question, I do think both organizations, so we pay attention to, we want to know what they think. They have some, but they don't so much determine our views often. I think that could be exaggerated.
I would just say, you know, as a rabbi, you know, I do not get in the business of endorsing, you know, this or that, you know, either J Street or APAC per se. David, Congressman Price knows that, you know, I've seen him about a number of initiatives that APAC has put forward and you know, was part of that. But what I communicate to our community is that it is important to participate. It's important as any Americans, that American Jews should never be ashamed to be part of our political process, to make our views known, to be resources of information if we feel that we can be resources, because we are in Israel and connected. Many of us have family and other connections there. And that as people in my congregation have heard me say, I think that a vision of Judaism that is just a set of ideas, but that cuts itself off from the fate of the Jewish people in the world, is a thin one. That Jews have, we began as a people. We are a people, and the state of Israel has half of the world's Jews under its protective umbrella, and it is the most important project of the Jewish people since the Second Temple was destroyed in the year 70. I mean, it is an enormously important project of the Jewish people, and we should and we face tough times, but we, as my teacher Daniel Hartman said, I'm not going to have the Jewish people walk away from each other on my watch. We should be engaged and care about what happens. And I will just end by saying that we should be grateful to our representatives, to people like Congressman Price, who are informed and thoughtful and caring and understanding. And you know, we have to not only hope but insist upon that from our representatives.
Well, I think that's a great place to finish. We haven't exhausted the topics, but I do believe that we're about to be invaded by a large group of young people who want to make paper turkeys. So the event has no choice. Let me also come in. Thank you, Congressman Price and Rabbi Greyber. Thank you again, both welcomes.